Brad Underwood, Reload member, says, something I've been wondering about since Bruen is the phrase in common use. Seems to me that, yes, while whatever hardware that is out there today in American society that is in common use should be fair game for gun owners to own for self-defense, but that's common use by today's standard. Standards can and do change. What will be considered common use in 5, 10, or 20 years? New developments and new technologies in the firearms space are obviously not in common use when first entering the market. They are new and therefore uncommon. I wonder if one tactic gun control advocates might try is to prevent newer firearms technology from ever being widely adopted, and then, due to its, quote, uncommon status, it loses some of the protections afforded under Bruen. But I'd certainly be curious to hear yours and Jake's thoughts on the matter. I think it's a really good question that gets at one of the critiques of Bruen and Heller that Professor Jake Charles has had, who was on the podcast last week. And so anyone who hasn't listened to that episode should go and check it out. But and I believe he brought this up when he was on the podcast about a year ago as well. But this has been one of the critiques, and you've seen this not just from people critical of the ruling overall, but also from like pro-gun points of view, is this in common use test, which really derives from Miller, actually, the case before Heller from the 1930s or 40s, where the Supreme Court at that time had decided that short barrel shotguns are not protected by the Second Amendment. And part of the reason is because they weren't commonly owned for self-defense, or for lawful purposes. They were viewed as like criminal guns. That's why they were in the National Firearms Act to begin with. But, well, not really. I guess they were in there because the handgun, they tried to have a handgun ban in the NFA, and the short barrel stuff was a way to keep people from just making handguns out of rifles and shotguns. But either way, I think this is a legitimate critique of the sort of major standard that backstops all of the Second Amendment's gun jurisprudence at this point, because it is a problem. What happens when there's a new technology that comes out? Can you ban that just because it's brand new and not in common use? I think, at least from a theoretical point of view, it's a pretty good question and critique. I will say, though, that in practice, from what we've seen, it's the problem has been more the opposite way, where you see most gun control advocates trying to mandate newer technologies that gun owners don't, and the industry doesn't actually want to implement. Right. That's what you've seen to this point with things like micro stamping or smart gun technology, basically biometric locks or RFID locking devices integrated into guns. That's more what you've seen in terms of uncommon firearms technology, is that the gun control advocates are trying to force it to be common. Uncommon or even unworkable technology, right? And usually it's used in a way to try and ban the guns that are already in common use. Does that make sense? Yeah. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. It's funny because I take our members' point about, how can this work for the guns that I care about? But as you said, it's more the gun control folks that are pushing novel technologies. Yeah. But one other sort of wrinkle to the common use standard, which makes it sort of uncertain, is how it'll be applied. So we've seen, for example, things like stun guns in the Caetano case in 2016. They ruled that those were in common use and thus protected. But you could just as easily
100,000 of those.
Right. There's a few 100,000, like you said, and you could just as easily then use that estimate to apply that standard to something like machine guns, which there's a couple 100,000 on the civilian market. But in dicta in Heller, Justice Scalia said basically that, the Second Amendment doesn't apply to machine guns because they're, so it's like you can see sort of where this uncertainty lies in the common use standard.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's absolutely a great point, because that's where I would see the conflict more, is with the things that the court has, at least in dicta, suggested are constitutional to ban that aren't protected by the Second Amendment, which are things like machine guns, when there are just as many machine guns legally registered out there, even though new ones have been outlawed for sale to civilians since 1986, there's already a stockpile of several 100,000 that exist. And then at the same time, the court says, well, stun guns are in common use for lawful purposes. So then there's only, I think they estimated 200 or 250,000 of those in a footnote in that ruling. So that there's certainly ambiguity in that standard, and it's also just like, is that a sensible standard, right?
Right.
Like, just because something is uncommon doesn't mean that it's any more dangerous or falls outside of the purview of the Second Amendment necessarily, or like, why should it? And then just because something is common doesn't make it any less dangerous. You know what I mean? Like, it's just kind of the result of a compromise ruling, which is what Heller was, right? They needed to get Kennedy on board. And so I think they had to put in all the caveats about basically protecting the National Firearms Act and bans on machine guns. So that's where they ended up. And yeah, it does create at least these sort of theoretical issues.